sometimes people kind of pull you onto a campus where you think something is going to happen, where you're told something is going to be there and it isn't. So I want to take a minute to tell you about something that happened to my daughter, who was wooed and talked to and told about a wonderful campus where people examined differences, where they were going to have a anti-racist colloquial all year, where people sat and talked and examined and had friendly discourse, and she found herself out at Ohio Wesleyan. And it wasn't like that at all. Within the first week, she had had a battle with someone about their homophobia. By the second week, she had had 2 battles around choice, abortion choice. And by the time Thanksgiving vacation came, she knew that she had to transfer because there was such an anti-Semitic atmosphere on that campus that she couldn't abide it. So it's like the old bait and switch. She got pulled out there expecting one thing, and it didn't happen. But I don't think that that happens here. I'm not sure. You can tell me when we talk afterward if that's the truth. Because when you end up on the right campus, at least supposedly you can work out your differences. But the danger at a place like this is the assumption that we all have that we're so alike that we don't have to talk about it. And then it never gets talked about. And you end up feeling very isolated. So that's the danger. If you assume people have the same values, you won't dig deep enough to challenge one another, to think it through and talk about what you really believe. There's a danger of people feeling shut up and shut down because they feel like they don't have all the answers. And they assume that their questioning will reveal them as either politically naive or lacking in the proper values for this place or lacking in the moral fortitude to carry out their ideals or whatever. So it's important, I think, that people just kind of take the time, build it in, do what needs to be done, and push to have it happen. And don't go around assuming that we all kind of feel the same way. In addition, at Ohio Wesleyan, to the anti-Semitism my daughter ran into, she also spoke about that lack of discussion around race issues, because people all want to pretend that they're the same so that they won't have the uncomfortableness of having to talk about it. She spoke about, in the supposed anti-racist colloquial, having people come to the campus and deliver these long, big speeches about racism, and the students sitting there kind of nodding with their eyes glazing over. Yeah, we know all about the racism stuff, right? And going back to their dorm to write their paper, to turn in, to get their mark on how much they knew about racism. But yet no one had really dealt with the issue. So it never got handled. It never got talked about. But they got a grade on it. So that changes nothing. If there are no planned discussions, if there are no unplanned discussions, if there's no talk about it, you might as well forget it. It's not getting taken care of. Black gay filmmaker Marlon Riggs spoke of this phenomenon when he said in his keynote address last year at a media network conference in New York, quote, "We've opted for an easy multiculturalism without developing a rigorous discourse that analyzes how multiple subjectivities intersect, compete, and collide." And that's what we do at a lot of campuses. We just don't deal with it. So I hope at Goddard you'll be a little more careful about that. Because, you know, as Audrey, whom you just saw, says in one of her speeches, she says, white people tend to see black people as one giant vat of homogenized chocolate milk. They make an assumption that if we're black, we all think alike. And as we know, those of us who are black know the differences are vast, monumental. It's the same way that people on the right view people on the left. We're all the same, but of course we know about the battles. We practically tear ourselves apart with battles on the left. So the apparent homogeneity of a place like Goddard can really fool you. Differences are there, and they got to be dealt with. And if we make a space for all of us to feel comfortable in talking about it, and then we make it happen, no matter where a person is in the spectrum, maybe they'll have a chance to pull out their best and to use it. And then we can give their best to them, and so on and so forth, you know. A few years ago, I spoke at a class, a women's studies class at Brandeis, on the subject of revolutionary feminism. And a few weeks later, I received from the professor some papers that had been written after that class. And one young white woman wrote, quote, "The first time I read Audre Lorde's essay, I Am Your Sister, Black Women Organizing Across Sexualities, I was very moved. I read and understood things which I had thought about but never really related to. But I also felt very," she had that underlined twice, "I also felt very left out. I didn't think that I was getting anything out of the Black issues discussed. I even looked through the list of organizations in the back to see where I fit. Did I fit in somewhere? Where was my place? I perceived this as an essay written to Black women from a Black lesbian. Since I am neither of these, does that mean I have to be Black to understand? My attitude did not start being answered until Bowen's lecture on revolutionary feminism. I heard her explain that feminism has an agenda which is inclusive, not exclusive, and about how women in different places face different issues. I heard about how our femaleness is a culture, one that is dispersed throughout the world. I was also struck by Bowen's insistence to allow everyone their own individual definition. Each woman is distinctive, each an individual, and that difference creates our strength. I do fit." Now, of all the papers I received from the class, that one encapsulated for me the point of why we share our lives and our analyses with each other. That young woman needed to hear those words at that particular time in the particular way, and she was open to it, and so it worked for her. It's so important to meet people where they are, but of course it's not always easy to do, especially when you want them to simply acknowledge the obvious problems and join with you to get things done. You get impatient, and so do I. I still do. But I have to tell you that the older I get, the less sure I am that I know it all. I remember when I was 19, having one of my usual heated discussions with my dancing teacher, who was my mentor, who was not as radical politically as I or my family was, and she still isn't. And she said to me, "Angela, you know more at 19 than you're ever going to know again in your life." And you know, I knew so little, I didn't even know what she meant. I puzzled over that one. I knew it wasn't a compliment, but I truly didn't figure it out for a while. So the older I get, the more inclined I become to give people the benefit of the doubt. People that I know are on my side anyway. Examining our differences to see where we are so that we can work together, attempting to mediate the differences, trusting other people until I have reason not to, and sharing information with people who want the information without trying to shove it down their throats in a self-righteous way. All these are ways that we can build constructive alliances that will be uplifting and ongoing. And what an ideal place this is here to do it. If you can't do it here, I can't imagine where. You've got all the ingredients. And that's how I feel about the college I'm attending now. It's another alternative place like Goddard. It's called the College of Public and Community Service at UMass in downtown Boston. And what we have is a cultural diversity class that's compulsory, which follows a self-assessment class that is also compulsory. We're in a class for 14 weeks, and for the first 7, we work on self-assessment, and we've got to pull out things about ourselves and share it. And for the next 7 weeks, we work on cultural diversity. And we get into groups, and we find out about one another, and then we bring it back to the larger class. And our final session is an interview that we break up into groups of 3, and each of us interviews people from 2 other cultural groups. The group can be anything. In my group was a white Irish cop, young man in his 20s, and a Yankee woman who was in her 40s. We push past some prejudices in that class, and I'm grateful for it, but it's compulsory. You have to do it. You don't get your degree unless you've done that work. And I wish that was happening on more campuses, because you couldn't avoid it. You can't get away from it. People have quit because of it. I'm going to tell you about one man in our class who was so obnoxious. He was a black man who knew everything. He opened his mouth and shouted down everybody. And about the 3rd week, a woman told him off because he assumed that people in the class didn't know what a certain word meant. It happened during a speech I was making too, which was interesting. And she told him off, and he left the class. He was so used to having his own way that he couldn't stand to be in the class with her, and he went away. So he stayed out for about 4 weeks. When we got to the end of that first section, that first 7 weeks of self-assessment where he had to stand up and talk about one of his roles, he talked about himself, and he said that this was the first time he had been in a class with so many strong women, people who were smarter than him, and people who weren't competing against him. And he didn't know how to act in a class in which he didn't have people to compete against, because the only person you had to compete against was yourself. We were like, is this Ron? Is he really saying this? Man was transformed. So those kinds of things, it's like my mind boggles when I think about having gotten to this point and seeing how things like that work. I have a couple of other prejudices. I'm kind of working on my prejudice against women religious, for instance. I consider them very, very brave at this point in my life. At one point I would be saying, oh, why bother? Organized religion, why do they even put themselves through that? I think that's a very courageous stance some of them take to stay in and work within that structure. I know I couldn't do it. And another prejudice I have that I am pretty much overcome is white Southern accents. If I'm looking at a person and they open their mouth and they are white and Southern and I hear that accent, my hackles go up and I get all out of sorts, and it's like they've got something to prove to me. But I've seen some bravery. This woman here that we saw, for instance, on this video, Mab Segrest, who works in North Carolina against the Klan, a white woman in that territory working against, that's courage. There's courage all around us. I see my daughter wading in and doing the kind of consciousness raising she has to do in order to survive on that campus. That's courage. And she takes hers from us, and we take it back from her. And we all can inspire one another with our little acts of courage that we make day in and day out. We never know where we're going to be, and whatever little piece you can do, that you can stand up for yourself and just do it, and find your allies wherever you are, and make it work for you. So whatever small piece that is for that day, damn, got it, good, and just keep on stepping. You know, it makes you live life on your own terms and not have to look at someone else's idea of what success is for you. I remember the anti-apartheid movement when it was tiny, when it was small, when in New Haven there were maybe 4 or 5 people who were working on that. And some of them used to come sometimes and meet in the basement of our dancing school, our cultural center. Sometimes it'd be only 3 who showed up for that meeting. I wasn't part of those meetings, but I used to see them come and go and would use the space. I remember when the Vietnam War protests began down on the New Haven Green. I remember when most Americans in this country didn't know the name Nelson Mandela. But you know, the people who were doing that work didn't do it because other people were with them. They did it because they knew it was right. It was their conscience, and they did it. And other people continued to join them, and before you looked around, here it was. And when it reached a critical mass, things changed. So that's what happens when people perform those little acts of courage day by day and just keep on moving and do what they know is right. Having a vision of righteousness is important. But when you have that courage of the convictions to the point where you live them day by day, year in and year out, to the end of your lifetime, that's living a joyous and meaningful life. It's not, oh yeah, I paid my dues. I marched in the South, remember, in the cause of justice, and now it's time for me to get a piece of that American pie, and you all go on and do that. I've done my bit. A couple of days ago, Jennifer and I were driving to the store, and we passed this restaurant in Brighton called the Sports Depot, and standing outside was a man holding a sign, and a woman was standing by him, and it said something like, "Stop male violence against women." Excuse me? Yeah, it was Super Bowl Sunday, and inside the Sports Depot were all these people watching the Super Bowl on the big screen. So just imagine what they went through as those people went in there, men and some women too, because you know women like to show how they support their man by bashing you. And so we just kind of rolled down the window and stuck our fists out and did a horn blow. You know, sometimes when you're standing out there, That's a moment that you need to hear some of that. This freezing day standing out there doing that. That was an act of courage. One of my favorite courageous men was Bayard Rustin, who was a black gay man who was an organizer. He was a labor union man. He was an international negotiator for peace. He was the person who did the organizing for the 1963 March on Washington. And many of the black ministers in that coalition didn't want him to do the organizing. So there was much battling behind the scenes as to whether he should do it. But as A. Philip Randolph said, as Martin Luther King said, this is the man who can organize it. And he organized the hell out of it. In fact, he also organized the structure of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which goes on to this day. But when they got ready to offer the directorship to somebody, they couldn't offer it to him. Because Bayard Rustin was a man living his life out in the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, long before there was any such thing as a gay movement. And he did it by himself. A very, very courageous man. The thing that bothers me about it, though, is that there are some of our so-called black leaders today who won't even talk to youth about the fact that Bayard Rustin existed. He only died a couple of years ago. I think it was 89. But they can't talk about Bayard Rustin. His list of accomplishments goes on forever, far, far beyond what Martin Luther King's accomplishments are. If you look in, say, Who's Who, 1987, there's about 2 pages on Martin Luther King, and there's about 17 on Bayard Rustin, okay? But they can't talk about him. Or Malcolm X. They've resurrected Malcolm X now, and they're shoving him to black youth. And across their chests, they have these T-shirts that say, "By any means necessary." You see, they take the half of Malcolm X's life before he went to Mecca and gained a larger consciousness. And that's what they want to keep shoving on these youth and say, this is the militant man that was, but the militant man was growing into a larger consciousness when he died. That part they don't tell them. So it's disturbing what's happening today and how they take our history and bury it and subsume it. Trying basically to retreat into Afrocentrism and take the youth with them. But you know, that's no answer. It's understandable. I mean, the racism it's a direct response to the racism, this despair and this turning back on oneself, but it's not going to do any good. We have in New York City, the Black Studies Department, City College in New York, or CUNY, I can't remember which one, this black nationalist called Leonard Jeffries, who publishes outrageous anti-Semitic statements. He's got tenure, though, so he laughs and giggles, and the media eats him up and publishes all his remarks. Dangerous stuff. But you know, not too long ago, black people were saying to white people, you've got to get rid of that ethnocentrism. I mean, we take David Duke and we excoriate him and we hit his head against the wall. And at the same time, if they got to give it up, we got to give it up. We got to move. We got to move to something bigger and better. Acknowledging who we are, taking pride in who we are, but then giving ourselves reason to take pride. The thing that bothers me is the religion part of it. When I get to somebody like Louis Farrakhan and realize how he moved into that position by espousing stuff that I don't think for 1 minute he believes. I know Louis, his name is Eugene Walcott. He grew up in Roxbury. The same time I was a kid, in the 30s and 40s. He's the son of an immigrant woman from Barbados, as I'm the daughter of an immigrant woman from Montserrat. He grew up, as I said, in our neighborhood, scuffling around and battling his way up with scrapping and fighting with poor whites and blacks on the streets, just like we all did, scrapping and fighting and having battles and some good times and some bad times, knowing each other as some good and some rotten folks of both races. He was a very delicate young man. He played the violin, wore glasses, sang. He was and remains today a good friend of my ex-husband. They were kids together. They grew up and formed a calypso band in which Eugene was the singer, called the Charmer, believe it or not. And my ex-husband played conga drums. Now, at no time when he was coming up did he believe that the white people in his neighborhood were white devils? You know, that's something that came to him much later, and I see it as a real mark of cynicism because I know he knows better. But Farrakhan, through Elijah Muhammad, stepped into a vacuum created by the black church, which had a totally stacked deck. It had all these people for centuries in the palm of their hand and couldn't seem to do anything with it beyond consolidating power for individual denominations of black churches. So my impatience with the black church is huge and never ending because all that power has been dissipated in ridiculous ways, I think. But if I go on talking about the black church, we'll be here until International Women's Day. So I'm just going to let it go. Because, hey, that's not really my battle anyway. My battle is about forging alliances between people on the left. Because if we ever got ourselves together, the right wouldn't have a chance. If we took all of what we have and we learned to talk to one another instead of battling one another, the right would not stand a chance. This is an upsetting time for those of us who grew up knowing that you can't lump all people of one color together. For those of us who all our lives have known different kinds of people intimately, it's an upsetting time to us because the urban cities that we thought by now would be fully integrated have turned backwards and are more segregated than ever. I'm dismayed by the numbers of white people who've never lived among any people of color, so they can continue to absorb as gospel the myths, lies, and stereotypes that abound about people who are not white. And I'm also dismayed by the number of young black people who've grown up in neighborhoods so racially cloistered that they can swallow propaganda put out by cynical race mongers who know that what they're saying isn't true, all for politics and power. I'm sure, for instance, that the prejudice exhibited by such rap groups as Young Nation, Ice-T, and Public Enemy couldn't have taken hold if young black kids grew up knowing other white people than school teachers, the grocer, the landlord, or the police. If they'd had friendships and scuffles and making-ups and schoolroom rivalries and neighborhood games with white kids, they'd not be so easily manipulated by race pride. And of course, the same thing goes for white kids. We don't know each other. So race pride to a certain degree is fine, but trashing and bashing and slashing another group to show your own solidarity is demeaning to your own and to others' humanity, and it's also very dangerous to anybody who happens to wander into your path. For instance, lesbians and gay men who are different from you. And as far as I'm concerned, the hate mongers of all backgrounds who are so-called religious leaders are not considerably different from those rappers. In fact, I think they're worse because they're educated, supposedly, and they're supposed to be using their education to help people in the world, and instead they're inciting them against one another. So I will never refer to Minister Farrakhan, nor will I call that deceased hate monger, Maya Kahan, a rabbi, he who believed all Palestinians should be driven out of Israel. Nor will I grant the title of Reverend to this hideously hate-filled, homophobic Earl Jackson, a black so-called minister in Roxbury, Boston. And I refuse ever to call that woman-hating hypocrite Bernard Law a cardinal. I grant to no men titles of higher reverence than the people that they call themselves serving. If they want to be go-betweens with whatever God they claim to share with their flock, let them do it as humble men with no holier-than-thou titles. They're Farrakhan, Kahan, Jackson, and Law. And until they learn some respect for anyone besides themselves, I don't even think they deserve the title Mr. Because they're really such power-hungry boys to my mind. And because we live so separately, we must make hugely conscious efforts to push beyond these intentional chasms created by years of separation. It takes work. And we've got to heal ourselves and one another and give respect to the hurts we all feel without wallowing in it. And there's no question. We all know that the larger white society has mined and sifted through and picked over the cultures of people of color in order to discover and extract the most precious, the most palatable parts, the adornments, jewels, the feathers, hairstyles, the music, the food, the cute sayings, the furniture, the artwork, all taken and used and abused. And the creators, the keepers of that culture have been used and thrown aside or ignored totally or killed for their treasures, many of which were religious icons to them. And now the descendants of both sides, the oppressors and oppressed, are trying to reach past all that dead and stinking history to forge the alliances that will take us to something more inclusive, more positive. Experiencing one another's culture is liberating and joyful when it's shared both ways, graciously and lovingly and openly, not exploitively. I'm talking about sharing what we have back and forth instead of buying it because you can afford it, offering nothing of yourself or your culture back, then ignoring the people whose culture you've appropriated. I'm talking about women who call themselves feminists, going to conferences that cost $200, $300, $400, and not making any provision for people who are working class or poor to attend, yet telling themselves they believe in a politics of inclusiveness. I'm talking about living your politics by sharing resources to make a really inclusive movement that will allow all of us to participate in bringing about change. Now, just as I have my disappointments with the black leadership, and particularly with the church, so as feminists do we have disappointments with each other. Feminist women on the left have got to be disappointed also at the slow to come around to feminism attitude of supposedly progressive men. Nearly a quarter of a century after the dawn of the second wave of feminism, we still don't have huge numbers of men working on women's issues such as reproductive rights or affordable child care. But what can we do? Beyond acknowledge our disappointment, try to work out our differences and go on. These are the allies we have, flawed though we all are. But I'd like to submit that many voices, these many voices of ours, united in diversity, if we refuse to be deterred, can unite to change the system of this government. If we refuse to be deterred. The power structure has always succeeded in keeping those of us at the bottom at each other's throats. Look how easily they're exploiting the supposed burden of the welfare now that they've looted the government of all its assets, the HUD money, banking money, everything else. And now that they've got the country in such a jam, it's supposed to be the fault of those at the bottom. Hence these incredible cuts, even in California, which has always been the most liberal state. Well, the bashing will work for a while. It's starting to. But it's only going to work for a while because there's only so far it can go. Because the majority of the public is fooled less and less, although, of course, still too much. So our united voices are starting to make a difference, as more of the so-called middle class is now recognizing what a shallow step they are from the welfare class. A depression will do that to you. Pat Buchanan said just last week about unemployed people in New Hampshire. Did you read it? Why these people really want to work, they just can't find jobs. He said it in this surprised tone of voice. Pat Buchanan. Of course, he's been duped too, but you know, it's difficult to feel sorry for a Pat Buchanan. So keeping the masses of different classes and ethnic groups segregated in mind as well as body is nothing but the same old story. But we have to make the change to move toward freedom. First, unshackle our own minds and make honest attempts to feel the reality of one another's lives and try to do something about bringing those lives into some semblance of equality. We do have much more power than we're using, you know. Global feminist Charlotte Bunch once said that each of us must become one-woman coalitions, speaking up for one another wherever we find ourselves. White women for women of color, able-bodied women for the disabled, lesbians for heterosexuals, young for old, etc., etc. And of course, the reverse holds true. Because, as Audre Lorde says, you'll be in places and will speak to people I'll never see. And I'll be in places and will speak to people you'll never see. And if we believe what we say we believe, we must work for those beliefs. Well, I've seen more and more of us becoming one-person coalitions. I used to think of this as putting one another's oppressions all in one sack with our own and carrying it along on our back as we went to the meeting or the conference. And I'd say, well, such a procedure would enable me to advocate for you and you for me and each of us for youth or old women or whatever. But Over the years, my metaphor of the sack became burdensome. Just the thought of dragging around that huge sack stuffed full of everyone's oppressions wore me down. So now I feel it differently. I feel that by being with one another, by speaking and writing and reading and demonstrating for the same cause, which is justice for one and all, regardless of the different paths we may take to get there, our burden has already become lighter. When you do this work enough, when you feel one another's energy and anger and pain and joy and victories, it becomes much easier and almost automatic to put expectations out there for all of us at the same time, because we know someone's listening. We've caught each other's attention. And so we really don't have to each be everywhere at once, because we feel that we're looking out for one another. Many voices united in diversity means that a white gay man will never again feel comfortable speaking for a black lesbian. It means that heterosexuals will not silence people because of their sexuality. And all of us now are beginning to look at buildings as we enter to see where the access is for disabled people. It means that we are uncomfortably aware when conferences take place and we look around and see no old women in sight. Our consciousness is now alerted to the fact that too many of us and too many of our institutions are exclusive. And that if we mean to make things right, we must, at least within our progressive communities, insist on inclusivity. You know, many voices united in diversity means more than working politically for a common goal, because that's called coalition politics. But there's more to this than coalition. It's alliance building. Having a diverse group of people in your life, in your whole life, not just to do that political act. It'll engage your mind, uplift your spirit, and enrich your soul. And besides, it's fun. Coalition politics accomplishes one particular goal, but if we want long-lasting solutions, we got to become aware of one another's pain, real problems. We got to get underneath one another's skin, feel the oppression as one with our own, take each other's agenda to the meeting, to the conference, to the negotiating table. Your agenda is mine, so you're always with me, and it becomes natural for me to speak up for you if you're not there, especially when I know you're doing the same. When I know my white sisters wouldn't dream of forming a steering committee without making sure women of color are represented in appropriate numbers, it makes it easier for me to decide how to use my time. When my young sister knows that we expect and value her input, she'll get used to speaking up to insist on the input of old women. And when my pro-feminist brother refuses to participate in an all-male power block and forces inclusion of lesbians, we in turn do the same. So as we carry within us the consciousness of how we need to create and sustain our groups, our power grows exponentially. It's taken some time, but we're learning it, and it's going to work. But as we learn it, we need to remember to pass along the models we create. We write down what we do. We make videos and audio tapes. We have workshops and spread the word. And we also talk about the things we didn't do right, so maybe we can do them better the next time. We use one another's words and actions in person as role models for the work we do. And speaking of using ourselves as role models and mentors for ourselves, when I was a woman living in visualization and anticipation of the life I now lead, I began reading Kate Millett, Adrienne Rich, Barbara Smith, Cheryl Clark, Shulamith Firestone, and other outspoken feminist women who helped me define what was in my heart and mind. But the person who most lit my passion and my fire to live this out-free, liberating lifestyle was Audre Lorde. Now, Audre's only a couple of years older than I am, but she's been out there so much longer that I use her as a role model and a mentor, as do thousands and thousands of other people, women and men. There's a radio profile about Audre Lorde on cassette in which several of us talk about her influence on us, people like Adrienne Rich, Alice Walker, and Joe Beam. Joe is the editor of In the Life, the first black gay male anthology. He died in 1988 of AIDS. Now, I don't remember exactly what I said on that Audre show, but because I have so many Audre stories, but I do know how relieved and encouraged and happy I felt that she existed and was out there in the world for me to latch onto. Her courage is extraordinary. She's used her life as a tool for her own and our empowerment. I can tell you one Audrey story. When I was in New Haven, I was running a cultural center. It was about 1977. And after I'd finished the work of the day and put my kids and husband and everybody to bed, I would go upstairs into my study and I would just gorge on reading feminist literature. So I discovered Audrey up there by myself. And I saw in the paper one day that she was going to be in Bridgeport at a women's restaurant called Bloodroot. And I went to that restaurant to hear her do a reading. And she was just wonderful. She said, "What are the silences that you live with day by day until you will sicken and die of them and still not have spoken your truth? If you don't speak, you will be sending little messages on Ouija boards back from the grave." And I said, I gotta be out there. I gotta escape. I gotta get away from here. I've got to be out there. And during her break, she came over. I was sitting at a table with another black woman I didn't know. We had just happened to sit there together. She was living under similar circumstances in Darien, and I was in New Haven, both of us trying to get out of the suppression of our lives. And Audrey came over to us, and she gave us each a little business card. And she said in that wonderful way, "If you ever need, just call up and talk to me. I'll be on the other end of the phone." And I said, like, wow. You imagine this woman just coming over and saying this. It was wonderful. And I kept that card for years. I carried it around. I never, I don't think I could have called her up. But having it and knowing that I could gave me a lot of power and a lot of strength. And I knew when she spoke then that I was going to leave and that I was going to live out and that I was going to speak out, just as I'm doing now. So she was my role model. And now here I am being that for other women. And I don't take that lightly, because when I heard her say what she said there in Bridgeport, I knew how important it was going to be for more of us to get out there. Of course, at the time, I thought that by this time there would be an army of us tramping behind her out there, but this is still, maybe next year. But, I became aware of how that was working very shortly after I spoke out on the Boston Common during a gay pride event. I think it was in 84 or 5. And they were taping it, but I didn't know it was being taped until about a month later when I saw a woman at a concert, a very straight-looking woman. She looked like a school teacher with her hair all pulled back in a bun and little glasses, and she had a little boy by the hand, and she came up to me and she said, I saw you, I have your video at home. And I said, wow, I haven't made a video. And she said, yes. She said, I saw you on Gay Pride. And she was in the process of trying to adopt this little boy who was her foster child. And she said she wouldn't have dared come out to a Gay Pride march. But that evening, she was looking at TV, and I came on the cable show, and she said, I jumped up and ran over and kissed the screen to see a black lesbian out there actually saying that she was a lesbian. And then she taped it. I still haven't managed to get the tape, but that was wonderful. So it started to happen very shortly after I stepped out there. So I know I'm out there, and who knows who it is who's looking, who needs to see me at the moment, the same way I needed to see Audrey. But I must say, in the middle of all this, that we must remember the women's movement, the feminist agenda. They're trying to beat us back on it. People want to make feminism a dirty word, like politically correct. Well, I don't buy either concept. We're fragmented. We're working on 1,001 things. Maybe we should be, I don't know, but we're here in all our parts, working, laughing, loving our way through it all, making it up as we go along, enjoying our lives. And journalists love to talk about the era of post-feminism. Post. Does that mean it's over? Pre-feminism, I can understand. That's before consciousness. But how do you then become unconscious once you've become conscious? And once you've discovered something, then you undiscover it, right? Post-feminism sounds to me like something that they've cooked up hoping that it will go away. But it's not going. Feminism is within us. It's within our minds and hearts, our blood, our bone and marrow, and every shaft of hair on our heads. It's in the words we speak, the words we write, the songs we sing. It's in the petitions we sign, the laws we support, the laws we defy. And it's in our belief in one another, in spite of attempts to ridicule and taunt us and name call. Because there's a whole generation in place, children of the women from the second wave of feminism. Not just our biological, but our ideological children as well. Students, relatives, and neighbors. And those young people, women and men, have had passed along to them a legacy of challenge, of defiance, of civil disobedience, of living and working across barriers of race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, age, physical abilities. They're already passing along their own consciousness to their own children, their own expectations and visions. My daughter's part of that generation. And so is the young white man in my class at school who's a member of a group I grew up despising, white Irish cops. When we had our cultural diversity final interview, he was my first choice for an interview, and I was his. And he says, yes, Irish cops are racist, and he hears things out of their mouths that would shock and embarrass him to repeat. They are so racist. But he feels privileged that he and guys of his age and background are lucky enough to meet people like me and others who challenge the system and give him a chance to work against his upbringing. And he feels that his children and those of his friends are going to be even less racist than the people of his generation. That's very encouraging. He thinks feminism has been good for him. He says it's helping him and his girlfriend to live an easier life. So I pay that post-feminism garbage no attention at all. And finally, I want to tell you about an article that I saw yesterday, just after finishing writing this very passage. It's in this month's Ms. by a young black woman named Rebecca Walker. She's a student at Yale and a contributing editor to Ms. And hers is one of several pieces about the Anita Hill Clarence Thomas event, which she calls a sensationalized assault of the human spirit. She tells of the disagreement she had about the hearing with the man she's intimate with. Then, after describing a particularly horrendous incident on a train, she closes with these comments. Quote, I begin to realize that I owe it to myself, to my little sister on the train, to all the daughters yet to be born, to push beyond my rage and articulate an agenda. After battling with ideas of separatism and militancy, I realize that I must undergo a transformation if I am truly committed to women's empowerment. My anger and awareness must translate into tangible action. I am ready to decide, as my mother decided before me, to devote much of my energy to the history, health, and healing of women. Each of my choices will have to hold to my feminist standard of justice. To be a feminist is to integrate an ideology of equality and female empowerment into the very fiber of my life. It is to search for personal clarity in the midst of systemic destruction, to join in sisterhood with women when often we are divided, to understand power structures with the intention of challenging them. I write this as a plea to all women, especially the women of my generation. Let Thomas's confirmation serve to remind you, as it did me, that the fight is far from over. Let this dismissal of a woman's experience move you to anger. Turn that outrage into political power. Do not vote for them unless they work for us. Do not have sex with them. Do not break bread with them. Do not nurture them if they don't prioritize our freedom to control our bodies and our lives. I am not a post-feminism feminist. I am the third wave. That's Rebecca Walker. And I say, post-feminism, they wish. Because, you know, as the song says, we've only just begun. Thank you.